Here in Sacramento, California, lies this historical house that a woman by the name of Dorothea Puente lived, and she would invite elderly and mentally ill people who didn't have family or really didn't have people to take care of them. So she would bring these people in and give them a place to stay and feel welcomed. Dorothy would donate money to the city and donate a large amount of clothes to charity. She would quickly gain favor and popularity with the city and government officials. She was seen and known by many people as this sweet old Christian lady. She would tell many people to call her grandma. Everything seemed like it was going good and well for Dorothy and the people who stayed with her. Well, that's what everyone thought. Before we dive into this home and the secrets it holds, to better understand the story, let's back up and learn a little bit more about Dorothy. Things seemed so rough, and getting on the right track was just a challenge for Dorothy. Until she tried to get her life together, and in the 1970s, she would move to Sacramento, California. There, she would move into a new home and open up her home as a boarding home for elderly and mentally ill people that didn't have anyone in their life to help them. She would hold AA meetings at her home as well, which AA, if you didn't know, is Alcoholics Anonymous, which is an international mutual aid fellowship or meeting dedicated to help people recover from alcoholism through a 12-step program. But Dorothy would end up being arrested and lose her first boarding home. She would be convicted of theft as she was signing her own name on her tenants' benefit checks. She would end up spending 3 years in jail for this. Once Dorothy was released, she would be classified as a schizophrenic with no remorse or regret and should be a person to be closely monitored. But that unfortunately didn't happen. Then Dorothy would end up opening up another boarding home and would fall back to her old ways with the same tricks. She would bring in elderly and mentally ill people that had no relatives or really anyone to take care of them, or even to call in to check on them. Dorothy would be admired by social workers in the city, and in fact, she gained a pretty good reputation for taking in people into her home and helping them. But no one would be prepared for what was going on behind the scenes. Her parole officer would come to visit, which having a boarding home would violate her parole. So when the parole officer would ask why are these people in her house, she would say, "These are my friends and guests. There is no reason to worry. They're just staying a couple nights and then they'll leave." So the parole officer wouldn't ask too many questions after that. Then some of her guests seemed to start disappearing as it looked like they just left. And the weird thing about that was that no one even seemed to notice. In 1982, a 61-year-old woman by the name of Ruth Monroe moved into Dorothy's house. But not long after moving into the house, Ruth would die from an overdose. The cause was from high doses of codeine and other drugs that were found in her system. When police arrived, Dorothy would tell them that Ruth was depressed from her husband's terminal illness and that possibly she killed herself. Police would quickly write off Ruth's death as a suicide, and life seemed to just carry on as it did. Then, 3 years later, in 1985, Dorothy would hire a handyman named Ismael Flores to install some wood paneling in her home. And when Ismael finished the job, she would request one more thing before he left. She requested that a 6-foot-long wooden box be made so that she could fill the inside of the box with books and other items to put in storage. And along that, she would ask if he would help her take it to the storage. Ismael agreed, and he would build her this wooden box. After building the box, Dorothy would fill it, and her and Ismael would load the big heavy box into his truck and make their way to the storage building. On the way to the storage building, as they came up near a river, Dorothy made Ismael stop the truck and had him pull over near a riverbed. She would make up some reason why she didn't want to take the big wooden box to the storage anymore, and asked Ismael to help her offload the big box and toss it next to the riverbed. So they offloaded the box and left. Many people would pass through Dorothy's house and many would disappear as fast as they came in. But there would be one person who would stay in her house that would change everything. A man who was named Montoya. He was a mentally ill man who had a hard life and didn't have his family around to take care of him. He would go from facility to facility being moved around and was not given the help that he needed. Then Judy Moyes, who was his counselor, grew to care for this man and wanted to seek help and find a good place for him to stay. A place that he could be taken care of and actually get the help that he needed. Judy searched around to find a good place for Montoya to stay, and she would search and a few people would recommend her and say that there was a house that would take in people just like Montoya, and it was such a wonderful place. It was ran by this sweet old Christian lady and everyone called her grandma, and she was also recognized by the city, and so many people had good things to say about this home and the old lady that lived there. That home and the old lady they were talking about was Dorothea Puente. So Judy looked into it and was impressed by what she saw. Montoya would move in and stay with Dorothy, and Judy would check up on Montoya, and Montoya said that he loved the place. Dorothy would reassure Judy that he was in really good hands and there was just nothing to worry about. Then one day Judy called to check up on Montoya to see how he was doing, and Dorothy said that, hey, Montoya is fine. In fact, he actually just left for vacation to Mexico to go see his brother, but he should be back soon. Judy hung up the phone and thought to herself, this is strange and way out of character for Montoya, for he wasn't capable of going to Mexico or even on a vacation on his own. So a couple days later, Judy would call again to see where Montoya was, and again Dorothy would say that he wasn't there and not to worry, he'll be back soon. But Judy was persistent and did not want to give up on Montoya. Judy just felt like there was something wrong and just something wasn't right. So Judy would keep calling and getting the same response until Judy told Dorothy that if she didn't hear from Montoya the very next day, she was going to file for a missing person. So the very next day arrived and Judy received a call from a man claiming to be Montoya's brother. And the man claiming to be Montoya's brother would say that Montoya's fine, they're hanging out, they're having a good time, there's nothing to worry about, he'll be back soon. Judy had a gut feeling that something didn't feel right, so she called the police and filed for a missing person. Later, police would head over to Dorothy's house to investigate, and they would interview everyone in the house that was living there at the time. And still, Dorothy would tell the same story that she told Judy, that Montoya had left for vacation to go see his brother in Mexico, and he would be back soon. And the other people in the house would say the exact same thing, that Montoya left for vacation. As investigators and police were about to leave the house, a man by the name of John Sharp would pass them a note that would read, "She's making me lie for her." The police would read the message and were shocked. They would relay the message to Judy, and Judy would be outraged that they didn't find the answers that she was looking for. She would tell them that, I know Dorothy is lying, and that they needed to do something about this. They told Judy that they were going to go back over there to see if they could find out more. And Judy at this point had a strong feeling that Montoya might be dead or possibly be buried in her yard. Judy wanted them to check this out to see if this was true. The police and investigators, with their suspicion, would head back over to Dorothy's house and ask if they could search her house. She said, sure, I have nothing to hide. They would search the house, but they didn't find anything. After they searched the house and were wrapping things up and about to head out, one of the investigators would ask Dorothy, is it okay if we dig a hole in your yard? This would help conclude our investigation here, and so that we can say that we checked everywhere and checked that off the list, and we can close this case. Dorothy looked confused and would say, sure, why not? Go help yourself. Like I said, I have nothing to hide. So they would take a shovel and they went to the yard and looked for a good place to start digging, and they started digging a small hole in the garden. As they were digging, they would see what looked like cloth, and so the man that was digging would set the cloth off to the side as they were digging. Then they would dig a little more and they came across what looked like beef jerky or this leather type of material. So he would set that alongside with the cloth. As they were digging, one of the investigators looked back and saw Dorothy staring down at them from the second floor. Dorothy then would come downstairs and talk to one of the investigators and say, "Is there a problem? Am I in trouble?" The investigator would say, "No, not at the moment." And she said, "Well, is it okay if I go buy some coffee? It's right next door to my house." The investigator said, "Sure, that's no problem with me." So he would follow her across the street to the coffee shop and watched her walk into the coffee shop. As they continued to dig, they would find more cloth and what seemed like beef jerky or this leather material. Then, as they were digging, they found a body. And that body belonged to a 78-year-old man named Leano Carpenter. They immediately stopped what they were doing and ran over to the coffee shop to find Dorothy, but she was nowhere to be found. They would keep digging and they would keep unearthing more bodies from Dorothy's yard. They would end up digging up a total of 7 bodies, and the last body that they ended up digging up was the newly decomposing body of Montoya. All the bodies were found decomposing, wrapped up in sheets, and the beef jerky and leather type material was dead skin that had came off one of the victims. It took almost a week to hunt down and find Dorothy. She had fled to Los Angeles. A man had recognized her from the news. Police would arrive and arrest her, but then she would end up playing the innocent old grandma that didn't know how the bodies ended up in her yard. She was really good at lying and keeping to her story. She didn't even flinch in the interrogation room.
This last individual,
Right.
Montoya. Now his disappearance is very suspicious. Who is lying to me, Dorothea?
Well, I'm not.
Mr. Sharp also told us that you had told him to lie
I did not.
about saying that he was there, because he later told us that
I
you
did
told him to
not.
lie. How do you explain the body in the backyard?
I don't
2.5
know.
feet down,
I don't
with
know.
clothing
I
and
don't
everything
know.
with it? How?
When you find out how old it is and see that I didn't have anything to do with that,
Later, before the bodies were found at Dorothy's house, a body was discovered in a 6-foot box wrapped in a sheet and decomposing near a riverbed, right where Dorothy had dropped off the box that she was supposed to take to the storage. After investigators dug up the bodies in the yard and found information in the house, that body would be traced back to a man that was living with her at the house at that time. After finding the dead bodies in the yard, they would comb the entire house. They found a calendar that Dorothy had in the house that had several notes written down on different days, and on one of those days it would say that Montoya left on this certain day for vacation, as this showed that Dorothy wanted police to find that side note on her calendar. That's how far she would go to lie and cover up her tracks so that she could live this lie. It was said that she would drug them over a period of time with mixing high doses of different drugs in their drinks and would make her victims drink them. She was also convicted of stealing and cashing over $100,000 in Social Security checks from her victims, putting the checks in her name. So she would house these people and take their money, drug them with high doses until it killed them, and then buried them in her yard. And on top of that, all the clothes that she was donating to charity were the clothes of the victims, and the money she was donating was the money from the victims. The lady that was perceived as this old, sweet Christian lady who helped people deceived the whole city. Dorothy was sentenced to life in prison and died in her cell on March 27th of 2011 at the age of 82. Okay guys, that does it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe. Peace. I love you. And as always, God bless.